baby of the millionaire cried nonstop in the hospital. Until Black Woman said what turned him pale, the sound was unbearable. It had been 48 hours since the crying started, and the walls of St. Mary's Hospital seemed to vibrate with each wail. The baby's voice had become part of the building itself, seeping into every corner, every room, making nurses pause mid-step and visitors lower their voices to whispers. In the private wing of the maternity ward, where the wealthy came to bring new life into the world, one infant's grief had transformed the entire floor into a place of helplessness. Marcus Thornton stood at the window of the nursery, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. His expensive charcoal suit hung loosely on his frame, wrinkled from 2 nights without sleep. His usually perfect hair stuck up at odd angles and stubble darkened his jaw. To anyone who knew him from the business pages of newspapers, he would be unrecognizable. The man who had built a real estate empire worth billions looked utterly defeated by a 7-pound infant who refused to stop crying. His son lay in the special crib, tiny fists balled up, face red from endless screaming. The monitors showed perfect vital signs. The baby was healthy, fed, changed, warm, but nothing stopped the crying. Nothing. Behind Marcus, Dr. Sarah Chen approached with careful steps. She had delivered hundreds of babies in her 15 years at the hospital, but this case haunted her. 2 days ago, she had fought to save both mother and child during a complicated delivery. She had saved one. Elena Thornton had held her baby for exactly 3 minutes before her heart gave out. The complications had been sudden, unexpected, unstoppable. Now the baby cried as if he knew, as if his tiny soul understood that the heartbeat he had listened to for 9 months would never return. Dr. Chen placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, feeling him flinch at the touch. "Mr. Thornton," she said softly, "we've consulted with specialists from 3 different hospitals. Physically, your son is perfectly healthy. Sometimes newborns can sense—" She trailed off, not wanting to say what they both knew. Marcus turned to face her, and Dr. Chen saw something break in his eyes. This man who negotiated billion-dollar deals, who never showed weakness in boardrooms, who had built his fortune through sheer determination, looked completely lost. "He's dying," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over his son's cries. "Listen to him. He's dying from the inside out, and I can't do anything. All my money, all my connections, and I can't make my son stop hurting." The words came out broken, each one seeming to cost him something precious. Dr. Chen had no medical answer for that kind of pain. She had seen grief in many forms, but a newborn grieving for a mother he had barely known was something that defied all her training. The crying intensified, if that was even possible. It echoed through the hallways, making other new mothers clutch their own babies tighter, making fathers pace nervously outside delivery rooms. The entire maternity ward had become infected with an unease that no one could name. Nurses whispered among themselves about the baby who wouldn't stop crying, about the millionaire who hadn't left the hospital since his wife died, about the strange heaviness that had settled over everything. Some of the older nurses said they had never heard anything like it in all their years. The sound wasn't just crying anymore. It was pure anguish given voice through tiny lungs that somehow never seemed to tire. That evening, as the sun set over the city and painted the hospital walls orange and red, something unexpected happened. The automatic doors at the hospital's main entrance slid open, and a woman walked in who clearly didn't belong there. Her name was Gabrielle Washington, though no one would ask her that for several more hours. Her clothes told a story of hard times: a faded purple jacket with a rip along the seam, jeans worn thin at the knees, shoes that had walked too many miles. Her dark skin was ashy from the cold, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that had seen better days. She moved through the hospital lobby with purpose, though her eyes carried a weight that made people unconsciously step aside. She didn't look like she was visiting anyone. She looked like she was being pulled by an invisible thread. Gabrielle had been walking past the hospital when she heard it. Even from the street, even through walls and windows, she heard that cry. It wasn't just any cry, it was the kind of cry that reached into her chest and squeezed her heart until she couldn't breathe. She knew that cry. 6 months ago, she had heard a different version of it, from her own son before the fever took him. She had been living on the streets then, too, unable to afford the medicine that might have saved him. She had held her baby boy as he burned with fever, as his cries grew weaker, as his tiny body gave up the fight. The silence that followed had been worse than any sound. Now, hearing this baby's cries from the street, something in Gabrielle broke open. Her feet moved without her permission, carrying her through the hospital doors, past the reception desk where the staff was too overwhelmed to stop her, up the stairs following that sound like a beacon of shared pain. On the 3rd floor, she found herself in the maternity ward. The crying was so loud here it seemed to come from the walls themselves. Nurses rushed past her, some giving her questioning looks but too exhausted to confront her. Gabrielle followed the sound until she stood outside the nursery where Marcus Thornton kept his vigil. Through the window, she saw him. This man in his expensive suit collapsed in a chair with his head in his hands while his baby screamed in the crib nearby. She saw the nurses standing helplessly around, saw the doctors checking charts they had already checked 100 times. But most of all, she saw the baby. So small, so alone, crying for something that medicine couldn't provide. Without thinking, Gabrielle pushed open the door. The room fell silent except for the baby's wails. Every eye turned to her, this homeless woman who had no business being in the private nursery of a millionaire's child. Marcus looked up, his face shifting from confusion to anger. "Who are you?" he demanded, starting to rise from his chair. "Security! Someone call security!" But Gabrielle didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the baby, and tears had started rolling down her cheeks. "I know why he's crying," she said, her voice rough from months of barely speaking to anyone. "He's not sick. He's not hungry. He's grieving." The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Marcus froze, his face going pale. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her hand reaching for her phone to call security, but something in Gabrielle's expression stopped her. "How could you possibly know that?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. Gabrielle finally looked at him, and he saw in her eyes a pain that matched his own. "Because my baby cried like that too, right before the end. Only difference is, he was crying because he knew he was leaving me. Your boy, he's crying because someone left him." She took a step closer to the crib, and several nurses moved to block her path. "I couldn't save my son," she continued, her voice breaking. "Couldn't afford the medicine, couldn't get him to a doctor in time. He died in my arms 6 months ago, crying just like that." The room went completely still. Even the baby's cries seemed to quiet for a moment, as if he too was listening. Marcus stared at this woman, this stranger who had walked in off the street and spoken the truth he had been too afraid to voice. His wife was gone. His son knew it somehow, felt it in every cell of his tiny body. All the money in the world couldn't fill that absence. "Let her hold him," Marcus heard himself say. Dr. Chen turned to him in shock. "Mr. Thornton, we don't know anything about this woman. She could be—" But Marcus was already standing, walking to the crib where his son lay screaming. "She lost her child. She knows this pain. Let her hold him." Gabrielle's hands shook as she approached the crib. She hadn't held a baby since that terrible night 6 months ago. She had avoided the baby aisles in stores, crossed the street when she saw mothers with strollers, covered her ears when she heard infant cries. But this baby's pain called to her own, demanded recognition. She reached down slowly, her worn hands gentle as they slipped under the tiny body. The baby was so light, so fragile. She lifted him to her chest, and for a moment everyone held their breath. The crying continued for several seconds, then began to change. It became less frantic, more like normal infant fussing. The baby's tiny fist grabbed onto Gabrielle's jacket, holding tight to the worn fabric. "Shh, little one," Gabrielle whispered, swaying gently. I know it hurts. I know you miss her. My boy missed me too at the end. Could barely open his eyes, but he kept reaching for me." Tears streamed down her face, dropping onto the baby's hospital blanket. "Your mama loved you so much. She loved you more than all the stars in the sky. She didn't want to go, baby. Sometimes people just have to leave even when they don't want to." The baby's cries had become hiccups now, his tiny body relaxing against Gabrielle's chest. She could feel his heartbeat against her own, 2 rhythms trying to find harmony. Marcus watched in stunned silence as this homeless woman accomplished what no doctor, no nurse, no amount of money had been able to do. His son was calming down. How? Marcus whispered. Gabrielle looked at him over the baby's head. Because I'm not trying to make him stop feeling it. I'm feeling it with him. Sometimes that's all we need. Someone who understands the hurt. She continued to rock the baby, humming a lullaby she used to sing to her own son. It was an old song her grandmother had taught her, something about angels watching over sleeping children. The melody was simple but beautiful, filling the sterile room with unexpected warmth. The baby's eyes began to close, his breathing evening out. For the first time in 2 days, he was falling asleep without exhaustion forcing him into unconsciousness. Dr. Chen watched in amazement. She had seen many things in her career, but this felt like witnessing something sacred. This woman who had nothing was giving everything, sharing her grief to ease a stranger's child's pain. "What was your son's name?" Marcus asked suddenly. Gabrielle looked surprised that anyone would ask. People usually avoided talking about her loss, as if ignoring it would make it less real. "Jerome," she said softly. "Jerome Alexander Washington. He was 4 months old." Marcus nodded slowly. "My wife was Elena Rose Thornton." She held him for 3 minutes before... He couldn't finish. The two of them stood there, connected by losses that money couldn't measure or fix. Gabrielle continued to hold the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully against her chest. The silence in the room was profound after 2 days of constant crying. Nurses began to quietly leave, giving them privacy. Dr. Chen remained, watching over them like a guardian. "His name," Marcus said suddenly. "I haven't even given him a name yet. Elena was supposed to. We were going to decide together." His voice broke on the last word. Gabrielle shifted the baby slightly, looking down at his peaceful face. "He needs a name. Every soul needs a name to be called home by." Marcus moved closer, looking at his son properly for the first time since Elena died. The baby had her nose, her delicate features, but his eyes, when they were open, were Marcus's own. Elena wanted to call him James if it was a boy, after her father. Gabrielle smiled softly. "James is a good name. Strong name." She carefully transferred the sleeping baby to Marcus's arms. "Here, he needs to know your heartbeat too. He lived under his mama's heart, but he needs to learn yours now." Marcus took his son awkwardly, afraid of doing something wrong. But as soon as James was against his chest, something shifted. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake, just nestled closer. "Talk to him," Gabrielle encouraged. "Tell him about his mama. Tell him about the good things." Marcus looked at her helplessly. I don't know how to do any of this without her." Gabrielle sat down in the chair next to him, her own exhaustion suddenly visible. "You learn. Day by day you learn, and some days you'll fail and he'll cry, and you'll cry too. But you'll both survive it. That's what love does. It survives even when the person is gone." She pulled her worn jacket tighter around herself. "I talk to Jerome every day. Tell him about the birds I see, about the sunrise, about the kind people who sometimes help me. He's not here to hear it, but I say it anyway." Marcus looked at this woman who had lost everything and somehow still had love to give. "Where do you stay?" he asked. Gabrielle shrugged. "Here and there. There's a shelter on 5th Street when it's cold. Park benches when it's warm. I manage." The casualness of her answer hit Marcus like a physical blow. This woman, who had just saved his son's life, who had shared her deepest pain to ease theirs, was sleeping on park benches. "That's not right," he said firmly. "You need proper housing. I can—" But Gabrielle held up her hand. "I didn't come here for charity, Mr. Thornton. I came because I heard a baby crying the way my baby cried. I came because sometimes we're called to help, not for reward, but because it's what we're meant to do." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking, planning, the businessman in him awakening for the first time since Elena's death. "Dr. Chen," he called. The doctor stepped forward. "Yes, Mr. Thornton? This woman saved my son. I want her checked over properly. Full medical evaluation, whatever she needs." He turned to Gabrielle. "And you're not going back to the streets." I own several apartment buildings. You'll have a place, a proper home." Gabrielle's eyes widened. "I can't accept that. It's too much." Marcus shifted James in his arms, his voice growing stronger. "My wife would haunt me forever if I let the woman who comforted our son go back to sleeping on benches. Please, it's not charity. It's gratitude." Gabrielle was crying again, but these were different tears. For 6 months she had been invisible, a ghost haunting the city streets. People walked past her, around her, through her as if she didn't exist. But here, in this moment, she was seen. Her pain was acknowledged. Her loss mattered. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Marcus urged. "Say yes, and help me figure out how to raise this boy. I have a feeling I'm going to need all the help I can get." Gabrielle looked at the sleeping baby, at this tiny life that had somehow brought two broken people together. "Yes," she said simply. Over the next few hours, the hospital came alive with a different energy. Nurses who had been exhausted found new strength. Dr. Chen arranged for Gabrielle to be examined, treated for malnutrition and exhaustion. Marcus made phone calls, setting things in motion with the efficiency that had built his empire. But through it all, baby James slept peacefully, passed between his father and Gabrielle, always calm in their arms. It was as if he knew he was safe now, held by people who understood that love and loss were two sides of the same coin. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital room in soft pink light, Marcus stood at the window with James in his arms. Gabrielle sat nearby, wearing clean clothes the nurses had found for her, looking more at peace than she had in months. "Elena would have liked you," Marcus said suddenly. Gabrielle smiled. "Tell me about her." And so he did. He talked about Elena's laugh, about how she could make anyone feel like the most important person in the world, about her dreams for their son. He talked until his voice was hoarse, and through it all, James slept contentedly. When he finally stopped, Gabrielle shared her own stories. She told him about Jerome's first smile, about how he would grab her finger and hold on like he was afraid she'd disappear, about the song she sang to him. She talked about the life she had before, working as a teacher's aide, living in a small apartment, how one lost job led to another crisis until she found herself on the streets, pregnant and alone. She talked about Jerome's father, who had left when things got hard, about the family who had turned their backs when she needed them most. But she also talked about the kindness of strangers, the nurse who had stayed with her when Jerome died, the shelter worker who had held her while she screamed her grief into the night. "You're not alone anymore," Marcus said firmly. "By Nodi. Neither of us is." Gabrielle nodded, understanding passing between them. They were an unlikely pair, a billionaire and a homeless woman, brought together by the cries of a baby who needed them both. It wasn't the family Marcus had planned, wasn't the life Gabrielle had imagined. But sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the deepest pain. As the hospital began its morning shift, nurses stopping by to check on the now peaceful baby, word spread about what had happened. The baby, who wouldn't stop crying, had been soothed by a homeless woman's understanding. The millionaire who had everything had found what money couldn't buy, someone who truly understood his loss. Dr. Chen would later tell her colleagues that she had witnessed something extraordinary that night. Not a medical miracle, but a human one. Two souls recognizing each other across an impossible divide, choosing connection over isolation, choosing to heal together rather than suffer alone. In the weeks that followed, Gabrielle moved into a small apartment in one of Marcus's buildings. She would come to the mansion every day, helping with James, teaching Marcus the lullabies she knew, showing him how to comfort his son when the tears came. And they did come. James would sometimes cry for his mother, and Marcus would cry too, and Gabrielle would hold them both, this unlikely family bound by grief and grace. Marcus set up a foundation in Elena and Jerome's names, providing housing and medical care for homeless mothers and children. Gabrielle helped run it, her experience on the streets invaluable in understanding what people really needed. She would tell the mothers who came for help about the night she heard a baby crying and followed the sound, about how sometimes our greatest purposes come from our deepest pain. Years later, when James was old enough to understand, they would tell him about that night, about how his cries had called to a stranger's heart, about how his mother's love had sent someone to comfort him when she couldn't. They would tell him about Jerome, the little boy who never got to grow up but whose memory inspired so much good. They would tell him that families aren't always made the way we expect, that sometimes they're formed in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning, built on shared tears and unexpected grace. James would grow up knowing he was loved by many people, by the father who had learned to hold him, by the woman who had shown them both how to grieve and heal, by the mother he never knew but whose love had somehow orchestrated it all. He would grow up understanding that wealth wasn't measured in money but in connections, that true richness came from the ability to comfort another's pain. The story of the baby who wouldn't stop crying became legend. At St. Mary's Hospital, nurses would tell it to new staff, especially when faced with situations that seemed hopeless. They would say that sometimes the answer doesn't come from medical books or expensive treatments. Sometimes it comes from recognizing pain and meeting it with understanding. Sometimes it comes from a homeless woman who has nothing but gives everything. Marcus would often think about that night, about how close he had come to sending Gabriel away. He thought about all the times he had walked past homeless people on the street, seeing them as problems to be solved or avoided, rather than as humans with stories and losses and wisdom. He thought about how his son's cries had broken through more than just hospital walls. They had broken through the barriers between worlds, creating a bridge between penthouse and park bench. Gabrielle would think about it too, about how she had almost walked past the hospital that night, almost ignored the crying. She thought about how her greatest loss had become her greatest gift, the ability to comfort a grieving child because she knew that grief intimately. She thought about Jerome, about how his short life continued to create ripples of love and connection. She believed he had guided her to that hospital, that somewhere beyond understanding, her baby had helped her save another. The title, Baby of the Millionaire, cried nonstop in the hospital, until Black Woman said what turned him pale, became more than just a description of events. It became a reminder that our assumptions about people, about who has value and who has wisdom, are often wrong. That woman, Gabrielle, had made Marcus pale not with shock at her appearance but with the profound truth she spoke, that his baby was grieving and needed someone who understood that grief. She had made him pale with the realization of how much he had nearly lost by almost dismissing her. The paleness was his privilege draining away, replaced by a deeper understanding of human connection that transcended social status. On the first anniversary of Elena's death and James's birth, Marcus and Gabrielle stood in the cemetery with James todding between them. They had brought flowers for Elena, and for the small marker Marcus had insisted on placing for Jerome. James babbled happily, too young to understand the significance but old enough to feel the love surrounding him. "Thank you," Marcus said to Gabrielle as he had said countless times before, "for answering his cries, for answering mine." Gabrielle squeezed his hand. This man who had become like a brother to her, this child who had become like her own. "We all answered each other," she said. "That's what people do. We cry out, and if we're lucky, someone hears us." As they left the cemetery, James reaching for both of them with chubby hands, the sun broke through the clouds. It illuminated them. This family forged from loss, this testament to the power of human connection. They walked together toward the car, toward home, toward a future that neither Marcus nor Gabrielle could have imagined that night in the hospital. But it was a future built on a foundation of truth, that grief shared is grief diminished, that love transcends circumstances, that sometimes the most unlikely people become exactly who we need. The baby who had cried nonstop had taught them all something profound, that we never really stop crying for those we've lost. We just learn to live with the ache. And if we're fortunate, we find others who understand that ache and help us carry it. The story spread beyond the hospital, beyond the city. People shared it online, in churches, in community centers. It became a reminder that angels don't always come in expected forms. Sometimes they come as homeless women with torn jackets and broken hearts. Sometimes they come as babies whose cries force us to confront our deepest losses. Sometimes they come as millionaires learning that money can't buy what matters most. The foundation Marcus and Gabriel ran grew, helping thousands of families. But they never forgot that it had started with one baby's cry and one woman's courage to walk through those hospital doors. Every person who worked there remembered something different about that night. Some remembered the sudden silence when the baby finally stopped crying. Others remembered the tears on Gabrielle's face as she held a baby for the first time since losing her own. Still, others remembered Marcus, the powerful man brought to his knees by an infant's grief, finding strength in his vulnerability. But they all remembered the lesson, that healing doesn't always come from medicine. Sometimes it comes from recognition, from one wounded soul seeing another and saying, "I understand. You're not alone." As James grew, he would sometimes have nightmares, crying out in his sleep. Marcus and Gabrielle would take turns comforting him, singing the lullabies that had soothed him as an infant. They would tell him stories about his mother Elena, about baby Jerome, about all the invisible threads that connect people across time and space and circumstance. They would teach him that tears were nothing to be ashamed of, that they were the body's way of releasing what was too heavy to carry alone. They would show him through their own example that family wasn't about blood or money or social standing. Family was about showing up when the crying wouldn't stop, about staying even when you didn't have answers, about building something beautiful from broken pieces. The title of their story, Baby of the Millionaire Cried Nonstop in the Hospital, Until Black Woman Said What Turned Him Pale, would always make them pause. It had been a moment when everything changed, when the walls between worlds came down, when two kinds of poverty, one of money, one of spirit, were both filled by unexpected grace. Marcus had turned pale not from horror but from recognition, from seeing his own pain reflected in someone society had taught him not to see. That paleness was transformation, was privilege checking itself, was humanity breaking through. Years passed. James grew into a compassionate young man who worked alongside Marcus and Gabrielle at the foundation. He would often visit the hospital where he was born, where his cries had changed so many lives. He would stand in that nursery, now renovated but still carrying echoes of that night, and think about how sorrow had created his family, how his mother's death and Jerome's death had woven together to create something that honored both losses. He understood that he carried multiple legacies: his mother's grace, his father's determination, Gabrielle's wisdom, and Jerome's memory. He was a child of grief transformed into love. When people asked Gabrielle how she had known what to do that night, she would say she hadn't known anything. She had just responded to a call she couldn't ignore. She had walked through those doors with nothing to offer but her own broken heart, and somehow that had been exactly what was needed. She would tell them that we all have something to offer, even when we think we're empty. Our scars can be someone else's roadmap to healing. Our losses can be someone else's guide through the darkness. Marcus would add that wealth means nothing if we can't recognize value in unexpected places, that his billions hadn't saved his son from suffering, but a homeless woman's empathy had. He would challenge other wealthy people to look beyond their bubbles, to see the wisdom walking past them on the streets, to understand that every person carried stories that could change them if they only stopped to listen. The hospital kept a photo in their hallway: Marcus, Gabrielle, and baby James on the day they left to go home. Three people who shouldn't have been family but were. Three hearts that had found each other in the darkness and chosen to stay together in the light. Under it, a plaque with words Gabrielle had said that night: "Sometimes we cry out, and if we're lucky, someone hears us." Every day, families walked past that photo. Some were arriving in joy, some in fear, some in grief. But they all saw evidence that miracles didn't always look like miracles. Sometimes they looked like homeless women with tear-stained faces. Sometimes they looked like broken millionaires learning to hold their babies. Sometimes they looked like infants whose cries brought together what society had separated. The title, Baby of the Millionaire, cried nonstop in the hospital, until Black Woman Said What Turned Him Pale, became a shorthand for unexpected grace. For the moments when our assumptions are shattered and replaced with truth. For the times when those we overlook become those who save us. Marcus had turned pale because Gabrielle had spoken a truth he couldn't buy his way out of, that his son needed emotional connection more than medical intervention. That paleness was his transformation from a man who believed money could solve everything to a father who understood that love came in forms he had never imagined. It was the color draining from his old world view and being replaced with something richer. As this story closes, somewhere tonight a baby is crying. Somewhere a parent is desperate, feeling helpless against their child's pain. Somewhere a stranger is walking by, carrying their own grief like a heavy coat. And maybe, just maybe, they'll hear each other. Maybe that parent will let that stranger close enough to help. Maybe that stranger will be brave enough to offer what seems like nothing but turns out to be everything. Maybe another unlikely family will be born from shared sorrow transformed into unexpected love. Because that's what the title tells us, what the whole story shows us, that the people who change our lives often aren't who we expect. They're the ones we almost turn away, almost dismiss, almost overlook. They're the ones whose own pain has taught them to recognize ours. The baby of the millionaire had cried nonstop in the hospital, until a black woman said what turned him pale. She had said, "He's grieving, and he needs someone who understands." Such simple words, but they had changed everything. They had turned Marcus pale with recognition, with humility, with the dawning understanding that this woman he might have ignored on the street held the key to his son's comfort. That paleness was transformation, was walls coming down, was the beginning of a family no one could have predicted. And in the end, that's what mattered. Not the crying that had started it all, but the love that had answered it. Not the loss that had brought them together, but the life they had built from it. Not the differences that should have kept them apart, but the pain that had made them family. The title would always remind them of that moment when everything changed, when a homeless woman's understanding made a millionaire understand what really mattered, when a baby's cries built a bridge between worlds.